So today we're going to be covering a bit of electrolysis. Now electrolysis again requires us to know the basic skills that we did in this previous video, such as coheres, balancing equations, spontaneous, non-spontaneous difference, that sort of thing, yeah? However, we will still use those components in today, okay? So, the first thing that we're going to deal with is the idea of spontaneous versus a non-spontaneous reaction. Here is our electrochemical series. Here is copper and here is lead. Now, the spontaneous reaction that will occur here is between lead and copper ions, right? This is because it has a positive gradient, and the reason being is because this is a favorable reaction to occur. Essentially, the wording that we use here is that lead's conjugate is a weaker oxidant than copper 2+ ions. Remember, in chemistry, we're always thinking about the state of the lowest energy level that we're trying to go to, like in electron shells or that sort of thing. Here, the same principle applies, except we're just instead of using it for electron shells, we're using it for redox chemistry. Now, that's a spontaneous reaction. However, non-spontaneous reaction could be between lead ions and copper. Now, this wouldn't actually occur because here, copper's conjugate is a weaker. Copper's conjugate is a stronger oxidant than lead 2+. So the idea that I'm trying to get across is this positive gradient that happens for non-spontaneous reactions, and that's the main thing that we deal with in electrolysis, is that positive gradient. So then let's build upon this little idea. I'm gonna do a little bit of foreshadowing with the voltage because we need the standard electrode potential eventually. But then we'll move over to the actual design of the electrolytic cell. So here it has 2 electrodes. It has a battery, different from a galvanic cell. It also has an electrolyte, and it has this thing called a membrane, like a membrane barrier, like a cell membrane, like the membranes. This biology. Let's explain why do we need all 4 of these components? Well, the battery pushes the reaction to occur. Here, non-spontaneous reactions, the electrolysis only occurs if we use electrical energy, here in this case a battery, to push a chemical reaction, creating chemical energy, right? That's the whole point of electrolysis. Now, the battery needs to be orientated a specific way. You have to have the negative terminal, which is the smaller part, facing the cathode, and the positive terminal facing the anode, right? Which is this bigger part. It will make sense in a second. Now, the next thing that we'll look at is going to be the electrode, right? What is the point of, what are the electrodes here? Well, we still have the anode and the cathode. Remember, we have our site of oxidation and we have our site of reduction. However, they change polarities between galvanic and electrolytic. Here in galvanic, we do this thing called panic. Positive anode, negative is cathode, right? It's just a simple way of remembering it. So then we don't have to mix up between galvanic and electrolytic. We don't have to remember them separately. We can just remember that we panic when we see electrolysis. And of course, it has the same properties in galvanic cells. It's conductive. It may contain one of the reactants. It could contain a product, but in this case, it probably isn't going to. But yeah, that's the basics behind those 2 electrodes that we have. It's not very different from galvanic cells, as you can tell. Now, the electrolyte completes the circuit, because remember, a circuit has to be completed, has to have a full loop, as well as the electrolyte also contains some of the reactants in it, maybe some of the products as well, which actually allows the reaction to occur. Example, Pb ions. Remember, Pb ions aren't in a solid form, so we have to put them in the electrolyte, sprinkle them in, make it a little bit salty. Get it? Because ions produce salts. Now, the last component that we actually have to deal with, which is the big difference between electrolytic and galvanic, has to do with this plasma membrane here. The plasma membrane, the whole point of the plasma membrane is to stop the products from reacting with one another. So let's go back to our Pb and copper example. If we do our electrolysis, they'll turn into the products here, the Pb and copper 2+ ions, and those things will react with one another. Now, we don't want them to react with one another because I'm assuming you want the copper here. So instead, we have this plasma membrane which stops the copper ions from actually going back to the other electrode and reacting with the lead. That's the whole point of it. It's just to prevent the products from interacting with one another, creating a chemical reaction, a spontaneous chemical reaction, which could create a potentially big explosion. Boom. Now, now, we have molten versus aqueous solutions. These are our two solutions that we want to deal with, and here, for molten solutions, it is literally just, very hot, yeah? It's like about 1,000 degrees, maybe 2,000 degrees, because we're melting ions, right? Compared to aqueous solutions, which can run at lower temperatures. However, the issue with aqueous solutions is that here, water in aqueous solutions can act as a reactant. And that makes it unsuitable for specific metals that are weaker than water. In this case, potentially aluminium ions, sodium ions, lithium ions. Those things, they're all weaker. They're weaker oxidants than water in this case. So they might not be suitable for aqueous electrolysis. We may have to use molten electrolysis. That's the difference between the two of them, because you might say to yourself, no, why don't we just use aqueous for all of them? Well, in this case, it's because aqueous might simply not work. And I'll explain that concept in a bit more detail when we actually look at a question dealing with electrolysis. We'll finally get onto this question. Imagine we have a copper electrode and a graphite electrode. And inside our electrolyte, we have here lead. We also have here iron ions. We have lead ions, iron ions, and it's an aqueous solution. So here we also contain water. Now, if we look at our electrochemical series, right, let's highlight each one of our reactants that are present. So we have copper that's present, we have lead ions, we have iron ions, and we also have water. We need to do both waters. As you can see, there's multiple reactions for water. We want to highlight all of them. Now then, we want to see which one of these is the strongest reductant and which one of these is going to be the strongest oxidant. Now here, the strongest oxidant is going to be lead ions. The strongest reductant is going to be copper solid. So those are the two things that will be reacting. It isn't necessarily saying that these things won't react, it's that preferentially we will have, lead reacting more and copper reacting more. We might have some reactions with water and maybe iron ions, but it will be preferentially favoring lead ions in this case. That's the basics behind electrolysis, right? It is always strongest oxidant, strongest reductant, highlighting everything that's present and just going through which one's the strongest, which one's the weakest. Actually, which one's the strongest oxidant, which one's the strongest reductant. That's it. And here we get our two chemical equations, right? This is our oxidation half equation, this is our reduction half equation. Remember, our oxidation half equation occurs at the anode, because that's the side of oxidation. And the reduction reaction happens at the cathode, because that's the side of reduction. Crazy, right? I know. Now that we have those two there, let's think about, well, what is the voltage we actually need for this reaction to occur? So here, we'll use our formula for galvanic cells. We'll do the cathode, take away the anode, right? So here, this is our cathode electrode potential, this is our anode electrode potential. These can both be found on our electrochemical series, right here, right? We're going to use that formula, we're going to get some value for the electrode potential that we will produce using this cell if it was a galvanic cell. Now then here, it's not a galvanic cell, it's an electrolytic cell. So what's the theory that actually combines these two together? Here, what we need to think about is we actually need to think about the fact that we need a voltage greater than this voltage for this reaction to occur. Anyway, basically, we just need a voltage greater than the voltage we need for our galvanic cell reaction. So here, this would be the voltage required. Anything above this voltage would work in this case. Anyway, this is the basics behind electrolysis. Hope you enjoyed. I will see you later.